Hello, government students. Today we're going to continue our discussion of fiscal policy by looking at some of the problems associated with fiscal policy, as well as taking a look at the budget deficits and the national debt that the United States has incurred through the years as a result of our fiscal policy solutions. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with problems with fiscal policy. First of all, timing is a big problem with fiscal policy. It takes a while for government officials to recognize that there could be a problem in the first place, whether that problem is inflation or unemployment. So that takes time to recognize, but then they have to come to an agreement on a solution. Once they realize there's a problem, the president and Congress must work together to come up with a solution that both the president and Congress can agree to. That can take a lot of time. It takes negotiations, and it takes putting together a budget that reflects those solutions, and that budget might take some time to go into effect. For example, right now we're in the year 2022 as I make this video. Well, we're going to have a budget that goes into effect next year that would involve the fiscal solutions that we've come to agree on. So, just waiting for the next budget year takes a while, and then it takes some time for whatever solution you've agreed to actually take effect in the economy, to have an impact in the economy. So timing is a big issue. It's a bigger issue, in fact, with fiscal policy than it is with monetary policy. And that's mainly due to the political negotiations and compromises that have to take place between Congress and the president. Politics can also come into play. No politician wants to go to their constituents, the people that elect them into office, and say, I'm going to raise your taxes to fight inflation. If we're in an inflationary cycle, people want more money in their pocket to pay for the higher cost of the goods that they need to buy. Even though the whole problem with inflation is that typically there's too much demand and we want to reduce that demand. And one way we do that in fiscal policy is to raise people's taxes. Well, that's politically distasteful for politicians because they know that that will anger their constituents, the people who vote them into office. So even when fiscal policy says tax increases are the proper course of action, no politician actually wants to do that. So politically, it's dangerous for politicians to do the proper course of action in fiscal policy, especially in a period of inflation. State and local governments come into play as well. Most constitutions for the states across our country state that the state must have a balanced budget. Now, in a period of recession, as you'll recall, the proper fiscal policy solution is to go into a budget deficit. You want to increase government spending and decrease taxes in a recession. Well, that causes a budget deficit, and state and local governments cannot do that. By law, they must have a balanced budget. So if we're in a recession and tax receipts are going down because people don't have jobs, state and local governments will either have to raise taxes on those who are working, or they will have to cut their spending. Either way, that's the exact opposite of what you want to do in fiscal policy solutions to a recession. So the course of action that the state and local governments have to take actually works against the proper solution to a recession in our economy. Another issue is that when the federal government borrows money, that makes less available for private businesses. Again, if we're running a deficit, a budget deficit, we're taking in less money in taxes than we're spending, we have to borrow money. That is, the government must borrow money to cover that deficit. There's only so much money available to borrow, so if the federal government is taking a big chunk of that money that's available to borrow, that leaves less for private businesses, and that can slow down economic growth if private industry is unable to get the funds they need to invest and grow their business. And finally, fiscal policy, especially deficit spending, can cause interest rates to go up. And this is a little bit related to the previous bullet point. As interest rates go up due to the demand for money from the government, that will make it less attractive for private businesses and for individuals to borrow money to buy new houses or for private businesses to invest. So that, again, can slow down the economy as interest rates go up. It makes everything a little bit more expensive. Okay, so those are the main problems with fiscal policy. Let's talk about debt and deficits because fiscal policy will result in national debt and budget deficits. So let's make sure we understand what we're talking about here. Here's the definition of a deficit or a surplus. It's the annual difference between what the government spends and what it receives in taxes. So think of, again, the deficit or surplus is an annual thing, a yearly thing. When we talk about the deficit, we're talking about what's happening in a single calendar year. Most years, we do run budget deficits in the United States. I believe the last time that we actually ran a surplus in the United States was either in 2000 or 2001. We have been running deficits since then. Even when the economy is good and fiscal policy says we should be in a surplus, we still typically run a deficit. In good times, that deficit might be less than it is in bad times, but nevertheless, we usually do run a deficit, and that's the annual difference between spending and tax collection. The debt, on the other hand, is the sum total of all the deficits we've had in our existence as a nation, minus what we've actually paid back on that debt. So the debt is accumulating all of the budget deficits that we have year after year after year, minus what we pay back on that debt. And again, just to be clear, most years we do have a budget deficit, and we must, in most years, borrow money and go into a little bit more debt. Okay, so who does the United States owe money to? If we're in debt, we owe the money to someone. So let's take a look. Gosh, that's a pretty busy graphic there, but let's take a look at what this is telling us. The biggest chunk here, 40%, is U.S. individuals and institutions. The debt is typically financed through what we call treasury bonds and even savings bonds, which some of you may actually own. Individuals, typically wealthy individuals, will buy these U.S. Treasury bonds to include in their savings portfolios, and institutions like banks and large corporations may also buy some of these Treasury bonds. They're considered very safe investments, and when you own a Treasury bond, basically what you're doing is you are buying part of the national debt, and the government of the United States then owes you money. So the biggest chunk is owed to individuals, Americans, and American institutions. The next biggest chunk is the Federal Reserve, still an American institution. The Federal Reserve is the organization that buys and sells these big government bonds. The next largest is the U.S. Social Security Trust Fund. This is the money that's going to pay my retirement and your retirement eventually, at least part of your retirement. Social Security is what elderly people live on, and the U.S. government then owes these people who are elderly this money. And then you can see lots of other areas where we owe. A lot of people think that the debt is owned by China and lots of foreign countries. And as you can see from this graphic, China, yeah, we do owe China some money, but we only owe them less than 5% of our total national debt. We owe Japan a chunk, and these are other international countries that we owe money to. The total foreign debt held is 26.2%. Just a little over 1/4 of our national debt is held by foreigners. So about 3/4 of our national debt is held by Americans. So you could say that who owns the national debt? We owe ourselves. America owes itself the debt, at least 75% of it. And that means that the debt's maybe not quite as big of a deal as some people fear that it is, because we simply owe money to ourselves. Here's a graphic that shows the total U.S. debt going back to about the mid-1960s, and you can see that the debt has really increased through the years. This big bump right there was COVID, where we went into serious debt to try to pull out of the COVID recession. So yeah, the debt has increased quite a bit, but this is in regular nominal dollars. Now let's take a look at this graph. This shows the debt as a percent of GDP, the debt as a percent of the size of our economy going back to the same period of time. And as you can see, even though the debt is increasing, it's not quite as scary looking as the previous graph. And in fact, debt as a percent of GDP has been going down the last couple of years. So The best way to look at our national debt is as a percent of the GDP. We want to look at the debt ratio to the size of the economy. Here's the national debt as a percent of GDP going back to 1900, and look when it was the biggest. It's been big, here in the United States for a while, but it's not the highest it's ever been as a percent of GDP. The highest it ever was back here in the mid-1940s, and if you know your history and remember your history, this was during World War II. So the highest debt to GDP ratio that we've ever had as a country was during World War II, as we were trying to finance that war effort to ensure that we defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Now here's our budget deficits. Remember, that's looking at an annual difference between what we collect in taxes and what we actually spend in the government. And again, you can see deficits have been getting pretty wild, these big wild swings here. This again is COVID, when there was a huge budget deficit. But since the COVID recession ended, we're on the right track. The deficits have decreased significantly. I want you to take a look at this little bump here in the 1940s. Okay, again, this was the deficit looking at just nominal dollars, but let's take a look at what it is if as a percent of GDP. Boom, here's World War II again. The budget deficits as a percent of GDP were huge during World War II. They have gotten fairly big. Here's COVID over here on the far right. But again, if you look at it as a percent of GDP, it's not quite as scary as it would be otherwise. So, in conclusion, the best way to look at debt and deficits is to view them as a percent of GDP. That is, the ratio of the debt and deficits to the size of our economy. And even though the debt and deficits are high, they have been higher in the past as a percent of GDP, especially during World War II. Many countries like Japan, Singapore, Italy, and France have a debt to GDP ratio that's higher or comparable to the USA. We have a lot of debt here, very high budget deficits, but our economy is so big, it makes sense. Other countries have similar or worse debt to GDP ratios than us. And finally, if interest rates stay low, and they have been pretty low over the last 15, 20 years, we should be okay. As interest rates go up, the debt will become a bigger problem because a bigger chunk of our budget will have to go towards paying interest on the debt. But that has not been an issue, particularly a serious issue, for about 30 years or so. Interest rates have been creeping up lately. It could become a bigger issue if that trend should continue. And with that, we're done looking at fiscal policy. You guys have a great day.